Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. As part of a comprehensive analysis today, we'll be discussing 5 to 6 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. Good morning to all of you. Before we begin, let's look at the topics we are going to cover. As always, remember there's a test on the Telegram channel from all these topics itself, and we'll do 2 mains questions in the end. So the first topic is a very interesting bill which has been introduced in Rajasthan with regards to gig economy and gig workers. We will see a very interesting topic, allows us to revise a lot of things. Then we'll talk about Aadhaar-based issue in the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act or scheme itself. Then a very interesting static, however linked to the current affairs itself, which is called PDO, which is specific decadal oscillation. We'll talk about that also. Then a small protocol which has been taken under G20 itself, which is called the Jaipur call for MSMEs. We will talk about that. And then something which Pragyan has done, which has already made us proud, which is to found sulphur. Then India-Kenya MOU and Indian Army asking for more drones for the Ladakh sector. This is the basic agenda for today's class. Let's do one thing. Let's start with the gig workers and gig workers bill or gig economy itself. So the context I'll tell you first, then we'll go into the basics, then into the details, which is nitty-gritty, and then I'll give you the summary itself. So the Rajasthan government has introduced a gig workers registration and welfare bill of 2023, which is to provide social security, basically the concept of PPF or other forms of social security to the gig workers itself. However, this article has been written by very interesting personalities, which is they're related to 3 very important zones. One is an RBI related personality, the other person is related to public policy, and last related to general social development. So they identify issues in this bill itself and give us a lot of insight into how this whole economy works. So let's first understand basic what is gig economy. To give you a basic definitional aspect, because I will then bring it down further. Gig economy means it is a service economy, flexible, temporary, freelance jobs are there, and wherein a client is connected to the customer via an intermediary. Mostly the best example of this for you, a gig worker or gig economy, would be Swiggy, Zomato, Dunzo, any. That is basically a gig worker who is coming to you, and it's a gig economy in which you have part-time workers, you have contractual workers, you have freelancers. I'll bring it down a little bit further and simplify what a gig economy is. Think of it like this, that it is an informal economy or setup with formal companies. This is a very oxymoronish concept, which is oxymoronish, 2 contradictory things together. What a gig economy or gig worker or worker-based economy would be an informal economy or setup with a formal company. Now, how do I expand on this concept further? When I say informal economy, I mean they are temporary workers. They are either contractual or they are freelancers. Basically, they have no social security, which is the concept of paid leaves or the concept of PPF or the concept of EPFO based concept or any form of maternity benefits or paternity benefits. Nothing at all. And these workers work within formal companies such as, for example, Zomato, Swiggy, even Amazon. And very simply, these companies file for taxes. They are proper companies. However, their workers are informal. Their workers are informal. This is called informalization, a very standard process which is happening throughout India as of right now, which is to have a formal setup company having very small number of permanent employees, but then there's an army of informal employees who you don't have to pay for when it comes to benefits or social security. So basically you have a core team which is permanent, and thereafter you have a whole army of other workers which basically become a part of the gig economy or gig worker. And the benefit to the company is that they can remain formal or within the formal sector itself. These permanent employees get all the benefits. However, when it comes to the people who actually work, they are outside the net itself or outside the social security net itself. So, though we call it a segment of service, temporary, freelance jobs, a better definition would be this, which is that it's an informal setup within a formal company. You would have seen it for sure, even in Government of India nowadays. Previously, there were different types of tasks which were actually taken up by employees. There were different types of what we call as positions which were advertised. But now either there's the concept of MTS, which is a multitask force person, or it has been fully given to a contractual employee itself, wherein the Government of India has no obligation itself. So it is happening in the Government of India sector also, it is happening in the what we call as private sector. So private sector much more rampant and much more common. Now, you tell me one thing, which is that if a Zomato worker, for example, a delivery person, comes to your house, he represents Zomato. He represents Zomato or Swiggy, for example. He is wearing the t-shirt also, therefore an advertisement. Further, if there is any issue in the service, again it is Zomato's issue along with the worker's issue. So it is Zomato is also liable, worker is also liable. But what if on the way to come to give a delivery to you, a worker meets with an accident? A delivery man, a delivery person basically meets an accident. Who pays for the medical expenses? And the answer right now, before this Rajasthan, this whole conversation is that maybe there is a partial clause, but if we go by gig economy rules, the company is not liable because the contractor, the self-employed person, very simply got injured in something which he was doing for the company, and the company is just an aggregator. It brings all these contractors together and gives delivery of services itself. But basically it's not fair because the worker would not be on that route if it was not for the service itself. So the problem with the gig economy is that the formal companies gain quite a lot, and in the process of providing their services, the workers are exposing themselves to a lot of things for which they have no return for. So the first point was to understand what is the concept of informal economy, what is the concept of formal economy. Formal, informal mostly is defined in India as a concept of social security. If you are getting any forms of benefits, you are a formal worker with a permanent concept. Some contractual workers are also given a little bit of what we call as benefits, but that is the nature of the contract. Case to case basis, we can call it permanent or what we call as temporary. But the simple point is the gig economy is a contradiction, wherein an informal setup is working within a formal company itself. Because the companies are not informal. The companies are registered with the Government of India, with the Companies Act itself. It is most probably even listed in the stock exchange. Therefore, very simply, it is a stable company. Now, this is the issue, which is the contradiction, wherein you have the companies which are gaining and you have the workers who are losing. So in this context, what Rajasthan has done, the Rajasthan government has introduced, this is the second part. Now I hope first part is totally clear to you. The second part is that the Rajasthan government has introduced this bill of Gig Workers Registration Act itself, but it has a lot of issues. Basically, if we take the act itself, it's not a good model for regulating or helping or putting social security benefits into the gig economy itself. Before we go into the article, which has all the details, let me give you the 4 basic issues which the authors have pointed out. The first point is definitional issue, wherein The act itself argues that a gig worker is outside the traditional employer-employee relationship. Which makes no sense. I'll give you the exact wording. A person who performs work and participates in a work arrangement and earns from such activities outside of traditional employer-employee relationship and who works on a contract that results in a given rate of payment. So very simply, it argues that it is a traditional employee-employer relationship, but more than that, it is based on a contract, and it more than that is at a given rate. Now this is problematic because it is automatically saying that it is employer and employee relationship does not apply itself. And what is more dangerous is how it defines the aggregator, or very simply the company. It says that the aggregator or the company is nothing but an intermediary, and this intermediary, what it does is that it brings all the other aggregators together and give a service. Now if you can spot the problem here, the problem is that even the company is not seen as an employer. Aggregator is a digital intermediary, includes any entity that coordinates with one or more aggregators for providing the services. Now this is the problem. Very simply, you are putting this whole setup outside the employer-employee concept itself. That very simply, the gig worker is not an employee and the company is not an employer. It is an aggregator, that it brings all the different aggregators together, and this aggregator is nothing but the gig worker itself. So very simply, you are insulating the company from being actually an employer. So the definitional aspect here is that by saying traditional employee-employee relationship does not exist and it's just one entity bringing all these different self-employed aggregators together, you are automatically creating the second issue, which is that how do you then apply labor laws? If it is not an employee-employer relationship, then what laws will be applied? Then you are not calling it employee-employer. Labor laws works on the concept of employee-employer. So then what laws will you apply on this? And this is a problem in itself. These two are interrelated to each other, wherein because you are not defining them as a worker properly, you are not defining them as an employee properly, it automatically makes them a aggregator or self-employed person. And if you're a self-employed person, then how does an aggregator apply labor laws on you? So basically this defeats the purpose itself. You are introducing an act to regulate the gig workers, but then thereafter you are not defining them or even looking at them as a worker itself. This is the first two issues, because that is based on the inherent definition of how you are defining a gig worker. So we should not take this type of definition if the center is considering a gig workers based act itself or a bill itself. Now comes the third and fourth issue. The third issue is that it says that every gig worker has to register with a gig workers welfare board. And the problem here is that it says even if you are working for 10, 15 or if you are working for 1 month, once you enter and register, that is forever. Now the point is, not every worker works for one company. You would have seen it for sure. He would be wearing a Swiggy or a Zomato t-shirt, but he would be giving, for example, Dunzo or Porter, or Swiggy t-shirt giving for Zomato, Zomato t-shirt giving for Swiggy. Very simply, these workers are using the app of multiple companies to gain as much money as possible. Now, if you put them in gig welfare board as forever under one company, then you are taking away the purchasing power of that personality or that person itself. Because if I am getting registered as a Zomato worker, then Zomato can very simply say that I will not give you social benefits because you are what is called moonlighting, which is they are going and doing with Swiggy. However, Swiggy allows moonlighting, which is basically to work for 2-3 companies together at the same point of time. However, that may not be true after what we call as social security benefits come through. So the problem is that if you are forever under one company, it makes no sense. That is not the way the gig worker or the gig economy works itself. And last and the most fundamental issue with this bill is, it does not define what is guaranteed social security. That has been left to the aggregator, basically to the company. So we have no definition of how or what is social security, which again defeats the purpose. So if you look at it, the 4 fundamental issues just poke holes through the bill itself, and the bill actually makes no sense because there is no employer-employee relationship. There is no labor law which can be applied if it is not an employer-employee relationship. Further, you are not defining what is social security, and over and above that, you are actually binding that person with one company in your database, which makes no sense itself, because if you are a freelancer, you will work for multiple companies. So therefore, if you look at all these 4 aspects, you will realize that very simply it doesn't work, and the bill is not a good model. But why are we discussing it here? Because now there's a conversation about regulation of the gig workers itself, and you need to know that these things should be avoided, which is to call them aggregators, self-employed, to not basically put them in the concept of employer-employee, to not very simply put them in the concept of social security. The bill should define what is basic minimum social security. You cannot leave it to the aggregator or the company to define it. For them, anything could be social security. So 2 things we've discussed. What is a gig worker with gig economy, which is informal setup within a formal economy, and what is the act itself. When we talk about the act, you have definitional issues, you have the issue of labor laws, then further you do not define what is social security and what is the concept of binding a person to one company if it is based on a service economy where you have multiple actors and multiple apps. So this is the basic gist of this article. Now let me do one thing. I'll add the finer details and we'll read through the article together and we'll consolidate everything in the end. Remember, this is the basic gist. Definitional issues, no definition of guaranteed social benefit, workers, what we call as gig workers registration under one name or one company's name, and how do you give social security when labor laws don't apply itself. So let's add to the larger concept. So we know that this code draws on the Social Security Code of 2020 and defines the person. This is the worker who is defined as a person who is outside the traditional employer-employee relationship, and it defines the company as an aggregator, bringing in all other aggregators together. What does the article say? Clear and binding in terms of aggregator, as they are not employers. Very simply, it does not in any way say that an aggregator is an employer, and therefore the gig worker does not gain anything and he is seen as a self-employed person and not as an employee. So if he is not an employee and the aggregator is not a company or an employer, then what's the point of labor laws? Therein comes the second point. Very simply, across the world, in America, in California, it has been said that if a worker cannot decide the terms of performance, the working hours and other aspects, he may be a very simple delivery person, but he will be seen as an employee. If a person cannot decide his working hours, his performance, his basic appraisals, basic things, then he is actually an employee and you are an employer. And in the UK itself, the UK Supreme Court argued that Uber drivers should be treated as workers and not as self-employed. This is the contradiction with the Rajasthan bill itself, which is that it sees the worker as a self-employed person. Now, the Rajasthan bill very simply gives the benefit of doubt to the employer, or which is the aggregator, and takes away the right of the what we call as the worker. Now, coming out of it is the fact that if there is no employee, then how do you apply labor laws? Therefore, aggregators will continue to insulate themselves with the mandates of the labor law because the gig worker is not an employee. You had to say somehow that even though they are outside a traditional economy, they will be seen as an employee if they are working for example, 5 to 6 hours for an aggregator. This could be a much better. Within this minute, we have actually solved the issue itself. By just putting the hour concept, that if I am working for a person for 5 to 6 hours, then I am an employee. I can then work other 5 hours with someone else. But at least for that 5 hours, I am seen as an employee. And that would automatically make me eligible for labor laws. And that is not something which Rajasthan has done. Now, the question is that if he is not under labor laws, if he is not an employee, if he meets with an accident, who comes to the rescue? Who pays for that money? Right now, no one. It is the self-employed person. The third issue which the bill points out is that it is asking the details of the gig workers to be put into a platform, which is the Gig Workers Welfare Board. However, you see, such a database maintained by the board does not withstand the duration of the time of engagement with the app or platform. In other words, the workers continue with the platform itself, and the registration is for perpetuity, which is forever. So it means that if he is going to I am a Zomato worker and I get registered as a Zomato worker, I will always remain a Zomato worker because that is the way the registration is happening. But I will obviously work for 3 other companies. Then I will, if I do get any social security, I will only get it from Zomato. But what about the other 3? So this again limits the bill in its basic ambit. And last but not the least is, it does not define what is guaranteed social security. Tells us nothing about it. How does the welfare board work? How does the welfare be transferred to the employee? It neither defines the way social security is going to be applied, neither does it tell us how it will be constructed. Everything has been left to be formulated and notified with the registered platform, wherein it is deemed fit for administering under the scheme. So very simply, you're leaving it to company itself. So just to bind everything together, what we've done till this point, this is the issue. Definitional issue, which is the gig worker and aggregator are not seen as employee-employer. And if they are not, then how do you apply labor laws? And if you don't apply labor laws, you are binding that person to one company, and there is no guaranteed social security definition, construction, everything left to the company. So I hope that after this 1 learning and 2 revisions, I hope you get the point. This type of article is not to give you solutions, is to basically identify problems. And this can help you write a very good answer, wherein you can at least say that a bill in the future should not have the following issues. That employer-employee benefit should be, or employer-employee definition should be very well defined. It should be very well said that the labor law should be applied. It should further define what is social security. And over and above that, the board should allow for multiple registrations or one person being registered under different companies. So this gives you a lot of material to write in the examination for GS paper 3. So this is an interesting, very important article. Other articles were also there, but this one was the most relevant for a preparation vis-a-vis the other more politically oriented articles in that regard. Now, let's move to the second one. This is a smaller article, which is the issues which we are seeing in the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, or MG NREGA. NREGS. The point is that it is nowadays working on a model. Now please pay attention. It's nowadays working on a model which is called ABPS, Aadhaar-based payment scheme. Now let's try to understand what is the core issue. The core issue is that under ABPS, Aadhaar-based payment scheme, your Aadhaar card should be linked to your job card, should be linked to your bank account. Very simple thing. Very simple thing for you and me. We'll go and get our Aadhaar seeded with the job card and we'll get it linked with our bank account. However, 41% of all workers under this scheme do not have a bank account which has job card and Aadhaar card seeded to it. And therefore, 41% of the workers are not getting their salaries or what we call as their wages. And this is now becoming like a epidemic wherein 50%, close to 50% of the workers are not getting their wages on which they rely so much. The government would argue that this is to stop leakages. This is to make sure that the transfer is to the worker itself. But very simply, studies are telling us that the issues still are there. Reverse payment is also happening, which is it is going and coming back. Leakages are still there and transfer are still problematic. But the bigger issue is that a worker who works for 24 hours, 12 hours, 18 hours every day, when does he get the time to go and get it? And in a lot of cases, the bank may be one in 10 villages, a big bank, or he has to go to the city itself. Then he loses the wage of that day itself. So how does this happen? They digitized it, but the problem is that within the MNREGA scheme, the people who are there, they don't have digital smartphones, they don't have access also. So this is the daunting number, which is the problematic aspect. Here you can get a question, but generally you should know that the ABPS, what is ABPS, is now becoming a problem for the MG NREGA scheme. So let's try to understand it in a little bit better understanding. As the numbers stand out, 26 crore job card holders, 41.1% are not eligible for payment. The issue is under ABPS, the 12-digit Aadhaar number as his or her financial address is perceived, and the Aadhaar number should be seeded with the job card, which should be seeded with the bank account. And the Aadhaar detail should be mapped within NPCI also, because it's a direct benefit transfer. And the bank's institutional identification, IIN, must identify that it has been banked by or it is been mapped by NPCI. So the simple point is, it is not even Aadhaar linked to job card, linked to bank account, linked to NPCI. And NPCI should be linked to this bank via the IIN, which is the institutional identification number, which is again very rare when it comes to the banks which are in rural India. So an analysis which has been done recently tells us that in Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal and MP along with Rajasthan, active workers are 1.2 crore. Out of the active workers which are there, 1.2 crore will no longer get payments because they do not have ABPS enabled account. And in the Northeast, it is the performance of these type of bank accounts is even lower. In Assam, which has more than 63 lakh workers, 61% are not eligible. And in Nagaland, 6 lakh beneficiaries, 80% are not eligible. This is the problem. This is the core issue. 41% of all workers are not eligible to get payments because of the way it has been created, or this Aadhaar link has been created. You cannot expect a person who does not have a digital phone or even a smartphone to do this whilst losing their wages to go to a certain center for 2 to 3 days and get this done. We all know how Aadhaar identification, Aadhaar authentication, Aadhaar updation, bank account linking, how much time does it take? It's obviously not one day, be it any bank. With no criticism, with all due respect to all banks in India, along with the UIDAI, the simple point is it does take time. If Aadhaar updation will happen, it will take 6 days. Then it will go to the bank. That will take 4 days. Further, if it is linked to NPCI, it could take 3 to 4 days. 14, fortnight, 20 days it is taking. And the person will start to become more and more nervous the more time it takes. So very simply, 41% of the people do not have the resources, the time to go and get this done. 80% in Nagaland and 60% close to in Assam are not having this ability to get the payment also. These are very dangerous numbers. These are problematic numbers. Because very simply, this means that the scheme, which is the largest in the world, this is a badge of honor which we have, that one of the largest, one of the biggest social security net we have under the NREGS scheme. But now we are diluting it through the process of digitization, which is contradictory. It should become better, but it is becoming worse. So this gives you a cautionary tale, wherein, like we have social audits, we should have technology audits also. We did not take into account that 41% of all workers in India do not have the ability to get this done. We just have this top-down understanding. Okay, we need to stop leakages. So let's do one thing. Let's get this complex seeding done. But this should be done where the worker is, not the worker has to go and get it done. And most probably the provision would have been that the person will come to the worker. But again, the way this scheme works, maybe the person who is there is not that what we call as competent enough, digitally literate enough to do it also. People don't know their IFSC numbers. People don't know what bank account benefits they have. And we're talking about seeding, which is problematic. So this is called technology audit, wherein you audit how it would impact the workers, because now 41% of the workers do not have the wages they have earned through their very, very hard work which they do in the sun of India, or what we call as in the heat of central India. And if you see Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, MP, West Bengal and Rajasthan, very, very harsh environment in which these workers are working without any shade. And you are taking away their wages away. And this is the problem. We tend to do certain things which have unintended consequences, and the government needs to now step in. It has to transfer something before something like this, which is a very good scheme, gets diluted fully. Further, the logic which was given was to plug leakage, reduce rejections and speedy payments. But a lot of different what we call as NGOs and universities have done a lot of studies, and they've seen that there's no significant difference. If 2.85% of account transfer was getting rejected, it is still 2.1% under ABPS, because most probably the account has not been used, it has become dormant itself. Further, the transaction, what we call as volume, is the same also. So the intended consequence is not coming through. So this article is to identify a problem, which is that a very good scheme is getting diluted because of the ABPS model, wherein Aadhaar links to job card, linked to bank account, linked to NPCI, therefore linked to by the IIN. Therefore, it is creating a certain complex process of seeding and linkages, which is not possible as of right now for 41% of the workers for some reason or the other. It may be anything, but the point is we need to identify the issue and we need to do something about this, because we can't let these people go without wages for long, and it has been now close to 3 to 4 months they have not even received 1 penny through their DBT or through DBT transfer itself. This is the problem. We need to be cognizant of it, and we should in a way be very, very cautious in putting in technologies in places where there is no understanding, or we have no understanding of how it would impact at the grassroots level. This is a cautionary tale when it comes to e-governance. So this is for you when it comes to GS paper 2 and 3. When it comes to e-governance, sometimes have to be more sensitive. Thereafter, a purely static concept, and therefore I would have to discuss the static with you, and therein a study which points out something. The article says that tropical cyclones that originate near the equator, which is a very rare concept, but these type of cyclones are very, very devastating, are becoming more and more common in the decades as we see. And the last major tropical cyclone which originated near the equator is the cyclone Okhi, and it devastated parts of Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka in 2017. But the point is, this tropical cyclones in the Bay of Bengal is quite common. Arabian Sea is not quite common, but because of the warming of the temperature, which is the global warming effect, is now also allowing for tropical cyclones to develop, getting the moisture from the sea itself to basically become what it is. But the equatorial cyclones are even more rare than Arabian Sea cyclones. However, because of something called PDO, which is Pacific Decadal Oscillation, because of PDO, now the process of equator-based tropical cyclones are becoming more and more common, because PDO has now gone from its positive phase to negative. Now, too many technical terms I've used. I'll start from the basic itself. Now, this is the article saying a combination of global warming and cyclical events such as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that repeats every 20 to 30 years could make cyclones such as the equatorial ones more frequent in the coming years. And the data which supports us is that the fact is, between 1951 to 1980, and if compared between 1981 to 2010, there were 43% less cyclones between 1951-1980 period, 43% less than in the period between 1981 to 2010, because of the fact that during 1951-1980, PDO was in the warmer or positive phase. Now, let's define PDO. PDO is basically, if you understand El Nino, first I'll explain El Nino to you and then you will understand it. First things first, what is El Nino? What is called El Nino Oscillation, or ENSO it is called, El Nino Southern Oscillation. Maybe this would be a very strong point for you, but basics, let's try to understand. We know that our monsoonal winds, the southwestern monsoonal winds, are nothing but displaced trade winds which cross the equator, and because of the Coriolis effect take a right turn and enter into the Indian subcontinent. Standard? But the strength of these trade winds is not dictated by the equator itself, but because of temperature difference between two very important points. In a normal year, this is static ENSO I am telling you. In a normal year, Australia, Peru and Chile coast, you have the Pacific Ocean. Now, in a normal year, what happens is that there is a lot of cold water in this sector, which is the temperature difference between Tahiti and Darwin, as it is called. The cold water creates what is called a high pressure here, and there is relatively warm water on this sector, which therefore creates what we call as a low pressure. And in standard physics and chemistry, we know that all forms of circulation happen between what we call as high-low, which is from high to low. The warmer temperature of the ocean creates a low pressure. The colder temperature of the ocean creates a high pressure. and therefore the moisture laden, what we call as winds, start to flow towards the low pressure, and this low pressure wind thereafter crosses the equator and enters into the Indian subcontinent as the monsoon, or what we call as the monsoonal winds. This is a normal year. Now what happens is, because of standard processes but now exaggerated because of global warming and climate change, in an El Nino year, what happens? Same process, Australia, Peru and Chile. The water which is on the coast of Peru and Chile, it is cold, but because of the circulation of water across the equator, it starts to warm up. El Nino is the warming of the water of the ocean of the coast of Chile and Peru, and therefore what happens is, if for example there was a high pressure of 100%, here now the high pressure is maybe 40% or 50% strength of what it was. Therefore, still a high pressure, but not that much. So it is relatively weaker high pressure. And this means that in this sector, the low pressure will also become weak. And the circulation, if it was happening at 100% here, now the circulation is very, very weak. Maybe 30% or 40% of what it was. And because it is the same wind which used to go and become the monsoonal winds, monsoons in India start to fail, or the strength of the monsoon gets weakened because of El Nino. Because of the fact that the circulation was not as powerful enough as it was in a normal year. To give you a very simple example, in a more what we call as graphical way or a map-based concept, you need to have cold temperatures here. You need to have cold here. You need to have warm here. That allows for a high pressure and a low pressure, and therefore this is the wind which is going to become the monsoonal winds. However, when there is back circulation of warm water and there is a warming of the coast of South America, that in turn leads to the trade winds becoming a little bit weaker, and these weaker trade winds therefore in a way impact India by very low, or what we call as very weak monsoonal winds itself. So easterly winds weaken warm water to move towards the east, and in a normal year there would be a very strong wind which would allow for the concept of a very good monsoon. There's a corollary of this which is called La Nina, which you know, wherein there is too much cold temperature on the coast of Peru and Chile, which in turn leads to a very strong monsoon and could lead to flooding and a lot of what we call as water related hydrological disasters or hazards throughout India in that regard. But El Nino is when monsoon becomes weak. La Nina is when monsoon becomes very strong. Now, if you see, El Nino is a 1 to 2 year concept. Why am I doing this with you? El Nino is a 1 to 2 year based concept. But if you plot El Ninos across decades, and there's a warmer or there's a weaker, when you take El Nino into a decadal concept, it becomes PDO, which is Pacific Decadal Oscillation, wherein PDO is nothing but, if you see, long-term ocean fluctuation of the Pacific Ocean, which can be there for 20 to 30 years. Think of PDO as a long-lived El Nino-like pattern in the Pacific climate variability. The PDO is detected mostly with warm or cold surface water temperature north of 20 degree, and therefore El Nino over a long period is basically PDO if I have to simplify it to the least. However, it is a little bit complex than that. Just like El Nino, La Nina, PDO has a signature for a long time, and therefore we can't come to PDO. We don't know if it is positive or negative in the first 5 years. You have to wait for, because it is happening over 20 to 30 years, you have to wait for it. And therefore surface temperatures, it takes time to decide if the PDO is positive or it is negative. So therefore PDO is nothing but El Nino over multiple years or La Nina over multiple years. That's a simple point which you need to understand. That is why I told you the basic point of it, which is El Nino concept. Now, in 2019, we believe through the patterns which have emerged that PDO has entered the cooler negative phase, and if it remains such, what happens is because of this negative phase in which the water is a little bit colder, the equatorial water starts to boil up quite a lot. And when that happens, more tropical cyclones in the post-monsoon months will start to develop near the equator, which is not very common. Equatorial originated tropical cyclones are not common. They are only becoming common or are common when you have a negative PDO. And therefore, it is usually rare for cyclones to form near the equator. But when the waters are warm, they can gain more moisture and rise in intensity. So therefore, this article was actually a very simple point that equatorially originated tropical cyclones are going to become more and more common. However, that is not because of a natural process, that is because of something called PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. What is Pacific Decadal Oscillation? Understand it like El Nino. El Nino is the weakening of the trade winds, of which in turn become the southwestern monsoon, wherein the temperature difference between Peru and Chile and Australia is reversed in a way, and therefore the winds start to become a little bit weaker, and that in turn leads to a 1 to 2 year concept of monsoons being erratic more than they were. However, if it is happening over decades, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, therefore PDO is nothing but, as I said, a concept of long-lived El Nino or La Nina event. It could be either positive or negative. This is the basic point. I hope that these things now make sense to you, and at least we have revised the static portion of El Nino, ENSO, along with, so basically PDO is a bigger term within which you have ENSO. Within ENSO you can have either El Nino or La Nina. This happens on a year-by-year scale. This happens at a decadal scale. That is the basic point. Simple point. If you can understand this, you can get a very static GS paper 2 type question out of this area. With this, let's enter this small discussion related to MSMEs, which is that at the G20 Trade and Investment Ministers meet, which would technically represented 80% of the world's economy, there were certain things which were under consideration and were talked about. First thing was that the best practices in bridge building, in medicine, and in nursing, should be shared by all countries of the G20. But what we are more concerned about is that, as it says, best practices, global standard, bridge building, medicine and law and nursing. What is more important for us is the Jaipur call for action to enhance micro, small and medium enterprises. Please understand, Jaipur is the most important word here, because this can be asked in the prelims examination straightforward as what is the Jaipur call for action. Jaipur call for action is for the G20 countries to, very simply what we discussed last week also, which is to support MSMEs in the larger e-commerce market, which would allow them to also have a very good share. And because MSMEs employ close to 60 to 80% of the population when it comes to working population, it is a very good initiative that ways. For you, Jaipur call for action is the most important. And the help desk of the WTO, International Trade Center, UNCTAD have now urged G20 members to create data portals for businesses wherein information asymmetries are removed. And this resonates with what our Prime Minister said vis-a-vis to the G20 ministers, that MSMEs help translate global GDP to go up, and also employment is very important within this sector, and it allows for social empowerment. So before we go to the prelims bytes section, let me give you a basic overview of what we've done till this point. The first article, we tried to understand the gig workers, gig economy concept, an informal setup within a formal company itself, and therefore we talked about the definitional issues, whereas employee concept was not there. We should discuss the problem of labor laws being then applied, then the definition of social security itself left to the company, and last but not the least, of registering a person forever with one company in a gig economy. Second, we discussed the concept of ABPS, which is Aadhaar-based payment system, wherein Aadhaar linkages to bank account is now becoming a problem, excluding 41% of all workers in the NREGS scheme from getting payments itself. Third article which we discussed was static, ENSO, and the bigger word PDO, which is specific decadal oscillation, which is based on the ENSO oscillation itself. Thereafter, the fourth is the very simple point that we have a Jaipur call for action for MSMEs, and MSMEs have now become a focus of the Prime Minister, wherein he's talking about social empowerment by empowering the MSMEs. I hope all these points are totally clear in your mind, and these four bigger articles are totally perfectly clear, and you have been able to grasp the concept also. Now let's do the smaller topics, 3 of them, not a lot, straightforward. First is that the Indian Army has asked for 130 tethered drones and 19 tank driven or driving simulators. This is basically to teach our men to drive tanks, but what is more important is drones. We are now moving towards more and more drone based technology because of the standoffs which we are having at the Ladakh sector, and therefore very simply these small drones which can carry small loads also and for surveillance are now becoming the staple for the Indian Army, and they have asked for 130 drones which can be used for different purposes throughout the border itself. And we also want 19 tank driving simulators, which is a simulator which tells you how to drive a tank, and that could help strengthen our defense systems and specifically allows for better border surveillance. Therefore drones are becoming important. Thereafter, the second one is an interesting MOU between India and Kenya, which is about shipbuilding, and the Goa shipyard plus Kenya shipyard has gone through an MOU on capacity building and collaboration when it comes to ship design and construction. Africa is emerging as a very important partner for us, and therefore this could allow us to go a step further. And both ministers talked about training centric model wherein there needs to be a strategic partnership also. We can have deeper cooperation in the Indian Ocean, standard words which are used. What is interesting is, as a token of friendship, what we gave were 15 pairs of parachutes, main and reserve, manufactured by an Indian company to the Kenyan defense systems, so that they can basically, it's like a giving like a sample. If they like the parachutes, we can get more orders of it. But a shipbuilding meeting, parachutes are given as a gift is a little bit, in a way, ironical that you are talking about maritime safety, but then you're giving the Air Force parachutes. The simple point is, it's a way of very good marketing in the sense that we are marketing our defense indigenous industries quite a lot, and that's a very good way of doing it. It's a token of what we call as appreciation and gesture in that regard. Now, the last is something where ISRO is making us even more proud day by day. I hope you've already seen the Pragyan rover go off the ramp from Vikram lander, and then the first steps of an Indian machinery on the moon itself, and further it is exploring the different temperatures and the surface of the moon. It's all in situ observation. We already know that the lander itself has done very good research in the past 5 to 6 days, when it has actually found that when we look at the lunar surface, on the surface if it is 50 degrees Celsius, by the time we are going to the lunar subsurface, it is going to minus 10 degrees Celsius, which basically shows us that there is a major temperature change which cannot be there if there was no presence of water in that regard. So very simply, this quick cooling of the temperature below the subsurface itself is indicative of what India has been talking about, which is that water could be there on the south pole of the moon itself. This is the interesting aspect which the lander did. But Pragyan also confirmed, the rover also confirmed something very, very important, which was speculated quite a lot, is that there is sulphur on the surface of the moon, and therefore now we have found aluminium, sulphur, calcium, iron, chromium, titanium on the lunar surface, but we are looking for the most important element, which is hydrogen. If we are able to find hydrogen, we already know that oxygen, manganese and silicon is there. Therefore, we could basically produce water on the lunar surface through a chemical reaction. And this in situ measurements are necessary because there was a lot of speculation. Only when the LIBS, which is laser induced breakdown spectrometer or spectroscopy, was possible face to face, because our Chandrayaan 2 and Chandrayaan 3 orbiters were able to very simply find traces, but we were not able to confirm it. But the confirmation has come from first hand in situ measurements, which no other country has done, and we have now been able to confirm that sulphur is present. If hydrogen is present, it could be a game changer for the world itself and specific for lunar exploration and lunar camps itself. So before we go to the mains question and we end the session, generally we've done 7 articles, 4 core ones. I hope now you are going to go back and study gig workers, gig economy generally. Then you are also going to understand how, and this can be used in ethics, sometimes technology driven interventions can backfire. Third is to understand PDO if it comes in the examination, though it is the only way they ask you is in the mains examination, which is what is PDO and how is it related to ENSO. And fourth and last point is very simply the fact that you have a Jaipur call for action. Army needs more drones. Pragyan is doing very good work on the surface of the moon itself. For the next 10 days or 9 days, it is having the power to do it. And thereafter, last but not the least, is India-Kenya MOU. With this, let's look at the mains question. What is a gig economy? How can we regulate and create a social net for its workers? This is GS paper 3. A very good question. This is 15 marks if 150. Thereafter, what is Pacific decadal oscillation? How does it impact cyclones in this region? GS paper 2, pure geography question, physical geography, oceanography. Interesting. I hope you will be able to answer. So with this, I would like to end the session. I will see you tomorrow with another set of 6 to 7 articles out of the Hindu newspaper. Take care. Bye-bye. See you.